We're looking at session 187, Zechariah chapter 1 verse 18 through chapter 2 verse 5. It's one of these times when it seems like we might feel like we're flying a bit to get through that much. It's not quite as much as it sounds like. We're going to be looking at our title, Visions number 2 and number 3. Remember, this is the night that Zechariah had 8 visions in one night. We've looked at the first one. We're going to look at the second one now. His first vision, remember, signaled the coming of a new age of deliverance in spite of the circumstances faced by the Judeans who had just come from Babylon in the last year or two. In his second vision, this was a partial answer to the comfort to come that was promised in the first vision, namely that Israel's Gentile oppressing nations, they would be judged by the Lord. So let's begin and looking at verses 14 and 15. It'll take us a moment to get to 18, but we'll get there. Then the angel who was speaking to me said, "Proclaim this word. This is what Yahweh Almighty says. I am very jealous for Israel and Zion, but I am very angry with the nations that feel secure." That would be the Gentile nations that the angels on horseback in that myrtle tree stand said that they saw that the nations were at peace and at ease. And the angel continued with the word of God. "I was only a little while angry, but they," that's those Gentile nations, "added to the calamity." So remember, God has been using Gentile nations to dispense discipline to the northern kingdom first and then to Judah. And he says, though, that he became very angry with the nations who were abusing Israel and Judah. In the case of Israel, that was Assyria, remember, and in the case of Judah, it was Babylon. But then notice while he talks about the discipline of Judah, "I was only a little while angry. But they," those nations, "added to the calamity." What was God saying? He had discipline in mind. And these nations, Assyria and Babylon in particular, took advantage of God's calling them to be his instrument in this discipline. They took advantage of that and went beyond the bounds of any reasonable bounds, even of the evil that they did. They went way over the top. So this is the second of Zechariah's vision. And again, it's going to focus on the destruction of Israel's enemies, probably Assyria and Babylon primarily, whose evil intent went way beyond God's bounds and God's intention for discipline. And this vision is Yahweh's promise to turn his attention from the discipline of Israel to the judgment of those proud Gentile nations. The vision has 2 parts. First, there are 4 horns, Horns, followed by 4 craftsmen, who would be workers of wood, stone, steel, or metals at least. So let's look at part 1, Zechariah 1 verse 18. "Then I looked up, and there before me were 4 horns." That's Zechariah speaking, of course. Now, what about horns? Well, in the Bible, they're a symbol of strength. In particular, they talk about the strength of a nation, the strength of a king, or the strength of a people. So what or who did the four horns represent in this vision? They're, of course, symbolic. Well, that's what Zechariah wanted to know. Here's Zechariah's question in verse 19. I asked the angel who was speaking to me. We've been calling him the sidekick angel, or just the sidekick. Zechariah says, who are these four horns? He, the angel, answered me, these are the horns that scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. Well, Zechariah asks questions in each vision, and he gets an answer in each vision. God is known to answer questions his people have. He doesn't answer every question, but he answers a lot of them. Now, when we take the phrase Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem, you take those three together in a single phrase, it generally just represents the entire nation of Israel before the split, back when they were a single nation and not two individual kingdoms. This is before the split to the northern and southern kingdoms. Well, at times, Jerusalem itself, that's the capital of the united Israel, then the capital of Judah. Quite often, Israel is in this Old Testament is used as a synonym for the entire nation. Well, people differ on their speculations about the identities of the four horns, and they generally focus on nations that conquered or scattered Israelites, leading to the particular exiled state or weak, feeble state as Judah was at this time. Scholars are going to debate these things. Some of them say, well, I think the four horns are Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. I've got a little problem with Persia, I guess. I'm not sure Persia scattered Israel all that much, or maybe I'm missing something, at least to this point. Assyria and Babylon, yeah. Egypt originally and off and on, yeah. Persia, I'm not too sure about, but it's possible. Others say Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And here again, I've still got a problem with Persia. Greece didn't do a lot of damage to Israel, but some, and Rome certainly was in charge of Israel at the time of Christ. Well, I think what may be more reasonable is that four simply represents a complete number. In other words, they're saying these four horns represent any nation, any Gentile nation that has subdued or scattered Israel. In other words, all of Israel's enemies. I think that's very likely the case. Then Zechariah moves to part 2 of the vision, connecting it with the four horns by the word then. Look in verse 20. Then, meaning after the four horns, the Lord showed me 4 craftsmen. Again, the question, who are these craftsmen? And now, interestingly, Zechariah doesn't ask who these guys are. Not who, but he says why. Why are they coming? That is, what is their function in this vision, Lord? I don't understand. Look at verse 21. I, Zechariah, ask, what are these coming to do? Not who are they, but what are they coming to do? Maybe he felt he knew who they described. He, the angel, answered, these are the horns, the strengths, the nations that scattered Judah, so that no one could raise his head. In other words, Judah was so beaten down that there could be no further resistance. When it says no one could raise his head, that's an idea of being beaten down. And then the angel continues, but the craftsmen have come to terrify them. That is the four powers that are being spoken of. The craftsmen come to terrify them and throw down these horns of the nation who lifted up their horns against the land of Judah to scatter its people. Do you see what happens? Zechariah asks another question. God gives him another answer through his sidekick, the angel. And what we're seeing in this is it's not a very good deal to be an enemy of God's people. He deals with everyone who oppresses his people. Now, sometimes he lets his discipline go on for a while before he will take judgment against the enemy and offer them some form of destruction. Well, just as the answer reaches all the way back to verse 20, just as the four horns completely destroyed Israel, the craftsman will likewise destroy the four horns. So what's he saying? Okay, Israel, you've had all these nations who are scattering you all over and defeating you, beating you down. Every one of those nations will likewise be beaten down and destroyed. So God has made a promise to them. The instruments of my will who were involved in your discipline will be judged. I will take vengeance. It's ironic, but that's justice. For those instruments of God's discipline, God chose those nations, but they overstepped the bounds of reasonableness and went crazy, and they went way beyond what was required for God to carry out his discipline of Judah or the northern kingdom, Israel. So, just as God raises up instruments of discipline of Israel, he also raises up instruments in judgment of those instruments of discipline. Getting a little bit hard to say. Well, in the Old Testament, it was not unusual for God to raise up instruments of discipline for Israel. Most of the prophets spoke of it, and you continue to find them doing so. But, as I said, then he also raised up instruments of discipline for those who over-enjoyed their discipline of Israel. They're going to get payback. The craftsmen were coming to execute God's displeasure at the four horns. Thus, while the details are few, the message is pretty simple. Oppress Israel, and at some point in time, God will break you. But who or what are the craftsmen? Again, people speculate. And it depends upon, of course, who the horns were. If the horns were Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, then go in order. You would have Babylon, Persia, because Babylon defeated Assyria. Not sure how we deal with Egypt. I haven't worried too much about that. Babylon defeated Assyria and destroyed them. Persia defeated Babylon and destroyed it. Greece defeated Persia, and then Rome defeated Greece. So that's where you get Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. But if the horns were Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, then you got a bit of a problem. Persia overtook Babylon, Greece over Persia, Rome over Greece, but who over Rome? The answer is the Messianic kingdom. At least I believe that's the answer. So that means that these four craftsmen could have been Persia, Greece, Rome, and the Messianic kingdom. But no matter, what was God declaring? He's declaring the judgment of all Gentile oppressors of Israel and the restoration of Israel to the place of prominence in the world. The picture appears to be a description of the millennial kingdom to me, and I think you'll find that this prophecy through these 8 visions will lead you to believe the same, that we're talking about an eventual millennial kingdom as the final solution and fulfillment of these prophecies. Remember God's earlier promise to Israel back in Genesis 1, or Genesis 12 rather, looking at the first 3 verses. This is Yahweh dealing with Abraham. Then Yahweh had said to Abraham, "Leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to the land I'll show you." And Abraham eventually did. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." So God says, from you will come a great nation. That's Israel, of course. He says, "I'll make your name great. It'll be known worldwide," and it is. "You will be a blessing to the entire world," and through Christ we know that is true. And in verse 3, "I will bless those who bless you." And here's the other part, "and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the people on the earth will be blessed through you." God says, you lay a hand on Israel and you will pay. All Israel's enemies will be overthrown at some point in time, or points in time. Well, next, Zechariah is going to move to his 3rd vision. The verses we just read, of course, starting in verse 18, constitute the oracle that followed verse 2. It was not part of the vision, but it was a description of what God was saying will happen and what the visions mean. Well, when we go to vision number 3, we're going to remember that vision 2 dealt with judgment, and vision 3 will deal with restoration. But there's a new actor that's put forth here. Let's look at Zechariah 2, verse 1. "Then I," as Zechariah, "looked up," meaning he just finished vision number 2. He looks up, "and there before me was a man with a measuring line in his hand." And we're calling him a surveyor. "Then I looked up" indicates that this is a transition to a new vision. The measuring line implies the idea of rebuilding Jerusalem and the beginning of the prosperity and blessings that God had promised. And that's what we're going to see in this vision. Well, Jeremiah's got to ask his question. It appears as though he's asking the surveyor, whoever that might be. Interesting again as to what scholars believe about the surveyor. I have my opinion. You will likely at some point have yours. Zechariah 2:2. "I, Zechariah, ask, where are you going?" He, that would be the surveyor, answered me, "I'm going to go to measure Jerusalem to find out how wide and how long it is." Sounds strange. And why would he go to measure it? Well, this is the first question anyhow that we would ask, at least I would ask, you would probably would too. Who is the surveyor? Well, look at verse 3. Doesn't answer that, but it goes on. "Then the angel who was speaking to me," we call him a sidekick, "left, and another angel came to meet him." So the sidekick leaves Zechariah and heads out. Another angel comes, a rendezvous, and evidently talk. So let's see what's happening now. Look at verse 4. And said to him, this is the second angel speaking to the sidekick, run, tell that young man, who we got a problem. Notice it just says that young man. And here's what he says to tell the man. Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of men and livestock in it. Well, who do you think the young man is? Well, there are two men in the vision right before this, right? That's Zechariah and the surveyor. So that young man's got to be one of the two of them. I tend to favor Zechariah. So the angel was given a message to tell to Zechariah, who of course then as a prophet would tell it to the people. So I'm going to assume that Zechariah, as you mentioned, the only other choice is the surveyor. Well, the picture that we just saw was one of Jerusalem so bursting at the seams that many had to live in surrounding villages that have no wall. Notice Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of men and livestock in it. So either Jerusalem's walls are knocked down because of the expansion that's taking place, or the expansion is taking place in unwalled cities around Jerusalem that will handle the overflow Jerusalem can't handle. In other words, God is saying the blessings for Jerusalem are going to be so great, it's not even going to be worthwhile to measure the city, because it's going to overflow, and what its current size is right now won't even come close to holding the blessing that I'm going to pour out on the city. So if Zechariah were that young man, this would make sense to him. It makes sense to the surveyor. Hey, don't bother going to measure Jerusalem, because it's going to swell, burst at the seams and so forth. And Zechariah could buy the same thing. So we still don't know really to whom that was addressed, but I'm going to assume it was Zechariah. Now think about it. If a city has no walls, it could be in a very untenable position. There'd be no security. Remember, walls are a first line of security and protection for a city. But God said, and He's going to guarantee, though, that Jerusalem will be secure even without walls. And so you ask, how does that happen? Well, let's look at our last verse for this session. Verse 5. And I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord, and I will be its glory within. It's not just that God provides security, He is their security. He will be their security when this all takes place. And the glory of Judah will be the glory from God who is residing there. So God, in a sense, is saying, I'm going to reposition myself, my presence in Judah. There will be glory in Judah, and I will be a wall of fire around Judah as its protector. Do you think the Jews, hearing this wall of fire, could remember the Exodus? Do you remember something about fire in the Exodus? The pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud, they were a rear guard for the Israelites as they left Egypt, protecting them from Pharaoh's change of heart and mind. And the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud and pillar of fire in particular became the object of God's presence that led Israel during the wilderness days. So, what's he saying? The Lord's glory would return to the nation Israel, not just to the temple, where, remember, the temple always represented God's presence. He's now expanding and saying, my glory will be in the nation. Think of it. God's protection without, on the outside, God's protection surrounding, and God's glory within, internal to the nation. This is a strong promise that Israel had to be terribly excited about. It's not been fulfilled completely, and it will not be complete, I think, until the Lord's second coming. Well, we have several takeaways. First, God is a jealous God, driven by love for his chosen one. His jealousy is not that of the green-eyed monster. His jealousy is for the protection and well-being of his chosen people whom he loves. For his people, God is a question-answering God. We see him answering or getting answers to Zechariah time after time. In every one of these 8 visions, God answers a question Zechariah offers. Now, it's dangerous to be an enemy of Israel. But you know what? It's dangerous to be an enemy of the church, too. Most of our civilization and culture today doesn't believe that, but it is true. We are God's chosen people, as well as Israel is God's chosen people and chosen nation. So if you're a believer, you fit that category, warranting God's protection, his glory, and his keeping you secure. So, and does God have a right to do this? You bet he has a right to judge anyone who will try to take vengeance on a believer or on Israel. He has a judge. Those will be his instruments of discipline, likely, but he has a right to judge them in spite of that. People will say it isn't fair for God to use somebody to chastise Israel, then to punish him for it. Yes, it is. There'll be a major end times role for Israel. As we talked about last time, it ain't over for Israel just because there's now a church. Israel has a part in the end times prophecies. And finally, God is the believer's glory. God is the believer's security. Not only Israel's glory and Israel's security, he is the glory and the security of everyone who's put their faith in Jesus Christ. Well, in our next session, we're going to look at the oracle that follows vision number is it number 3? Yeah, there's an oracle following this vision number 3. We'll take a look at it, and then we will move our attention to vision number 4. See you then.